Dear all, welcome. Very happy to see you coming into the room, as we call the Zoom by now, in large numbers. I'm looking forward to this lecture, which is already the 33rd in a series that we started with Roskvit at the very beginning, actually, when we started Roskvit itself, which was in 2022. We started this series because for two reasons. We wanted to share with a larger audience what we were doing ourselves, so our projects, if they were wrapped up, telling about it and explaining the main findings, but also very much getting all other coalition members or even from outside the coalition with themes that we thought relevant for Ukraine, and that we would think that would help the community if those stories were told. They are always formal, but also very informal and very engaged with questions. So we very much hope that you will preserve your questions in the end for lively conversation. Today we have a lecture which is actually quite close to the coalition, because at the very beginning already two members from URAG, which is the Ukrainian Rebuilding Action Group, was also formed, and that was a group formed also in 2022 as an offspring from the American Planning Association, and two of its members, Tim van Epp and Nathan Hudson, joined the Roskvit coalition from very early on. So that was very inspiring, actually, to have a group in the US who worked on Ukrainian issues, Ukrainian city planning, also very rooted in universities, and therefore a lot of researchers. And there were also a lot of Ukrainian researchers actually involved in the research done. Recently, Tim van Epp approached us for the lecture series of kind of, we did now this 4 years of research and work on many Ukrainian issues or topics relevant to Ukraine, and shall we get it out via the lecture series. So that is actually what we are doing today. So Tim invited two speakers who have been doing a lot of research and whole books and a lot of work. So we asked them now to rephrase that in 15 minutes. So it's a challenge, I can imagine. We are very happy they're both here for a lecture on regenerative city planning and city regenerative systems, also more in general. So building back better with regenerative cities and regions, that is the title of the lecture tonight. It consists of two parts, one by Scott Edmondson. Welcome, Scott. Again, thanks for being here. An urbanist and researcher of these regenerative urbanism, and a former senior planner and analyst at the San Francisco Planning Department, where he worked on the biophilic and regenerative city program and the development of the integrated systems planning. He will give a more general framework of the theory behind the generative systems. And then for some practical implementations, Charles Kelley, welcome Charles, architect and urban designer who has over 35 years of experience and is involved in a range of sustainability-driven projects across the United States and Asia, and also have been working on a pilot project of eco-urbanism in Ukraine. He will give some examples from this wide range of experience. For the Ukrainian context, this conversation matters as an attempt to approach rebuilding through longer cycles, water, landscapes, resources, local economies, and the capacity of territories to sustain life in the future. So to not think only on the short term, but really on the longer term, and how to what you should do in the short term to attain that for the future. We have, and I'm very glad also you are here, Tatiana Samilev, who is also a ROSFIT member and also an URAG member. So it's really also a super nice overlap. Ukrainian, but worked for a while in the United States, also with URAG. So we asked Tatiana to give a kind of reflection on after hearing the two stories, what the relevance for Ukraine is, how we might implement those ideas, and also start a Q&A session and co-moderate that with me. So, all that said, I saw that in the chat channel you could already see that you can choose a language of your preference for this lecture. Everything is simultaneous translated by Olena. If some of you might be asking, what is this lady doing talking all the time? She's talking in Ukrainian. So if you have chosen the Ukrainian channel, you will hear her. And thank you again for doing this for us already also from the very first lecture. So without much further, I will ask Scott to start the share and give your thoughts and ideas. Yes, we see you.
Does that look good?
Perfect. Yes, it looks all good.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, Lilette, for that introduction and for the opportunity to engage with your community in this lecture. Good morning and evening, depending on your locations, participants. I'm pleased to be here today with my URAG colleagues to discuss the topic of building Ukraine back better with regenerative city regions. Lilette already reviewed the agenda. And I'd just like to begin by saying that this regenerative approach that Charles and I are presenting today arose in work that both Charles and I have done independently and in some overlapping collaborations, and really is arising out of the larger arena of innovation going on in the built environment. Today's lecture in particular arose from a series of projects over the past few years led by Tim Van App and other volunteers in URAG. In particular, the URAG Guidelines Part 2, Regenerative City, is a detailed description of this regenerative approach that we developed in 2024 as part of this work for building back better. And the rest of the guidelines address different technical aspects of the rebuilding challenge, as you can see. This work was then extended in a Regenerative City Symposium held in September 24, featuring the perspective of 6 primary practitioners and a special issue of the APA Division's newsletter published in 2025, designed as a first stop resource for interested professionals. If you staple those together, the 3 resources really constitute a de facto draft Regenerative City Practitioner Guide, which you can access with these links after the lecture, or feel free to email me as well. Now I'd like to begin laying the conceptual foundation for this regenerative system sustainability, or RSS, approach to understanding the challenge and requirements for an effective response. It's emerging from 30 years of sustainability innovation, but it's not obvious and it requires synthesis, connecting some dots to see the larger potential. We begin where we are, understanding sustainability as practice as we know it, If we want to build back better with sustainability in mind, we need to understand what's required and how to do it. Do we just continue doing what we're doing now, or do we need to do something different? Our approach to date consists of business as usual and sustainability as usual, for lack of a better phrase. Business as usual has no sustainability goals, simply economic growth and development, but it does use mitigation, that is, per unit impact reduction. However, as the economy grows, total impacts continue to increase. And in addition, those mitigations are only practiced where they're required and enforced, so they're not everywhere. Sustainability as usual has a definition and goals of sustainability that seem to vary by initiative. Generally, they're non-operational, they're environmentally friendly. But if we look at that in aggregate, what performance will it produce and when will we be sustainable? From this perspective, the problem is defined as environmental impact, therefore reduce it, sometimes at a systems level. And the solution is typically mitigation, but increasingly nature-based, ecosystem-related, net positive initiatives and practices. The result is that global society faces a sustainability planning dilemma. We face accelerating global system degradation after 30 plus years since Rio, following many big and little initiatives. Bottom line is that our current approach produces local value. That's not really the issue. The issue is that this approach is not and cannot logically change system trajectories. The implication is that we cannot continue to grow the economy without continuing to degrade the environment and accelerate this trend. So what do? We need a response capable of changing system trajectories. So what would that be, and how do we invent it? How do we get there? Fortunately, we can begin by simply joining the existing emerging approach. We don't need to invent it anew. The innovation is already bubbling up in a variety of our practices. But we do need to recognize it, learn it, and advance it in practice. Even more, cities around the world are now innovating toward regenerative urbanism with bold programs and projects, and we can join them. Briefly, the roots of this new regenerative approach reach back to and across familiar topics of our practices, and this synthesis produces regenerative system sustainability and the regenerative city as both metaphor and potential physical place. The challenge to urban professionals, if we see valuable potential in this emerging approach, is how to shift from net negative business as usual to the emerging net positive regenerative approach that can actually change system trajectories. This emerging approach is not widely recognized. Therefore, it's not pursued routinely or highly visible for emulation. Fortunately, we can begin now, as I just mentioned, and the next slides are going to describe the synthesis, the dot connecting of this underlying RSS logic to see if it's useful in that formulation. RSS provides both a specification of conditions and a method for aligning with them. The RSS theory specifies the conditions required for a regenerative system state to exist, to be possible. The RSS method aligns economic activity with those conditions. It's useful to understand it as a missing first-order necessary conditions logic. It illuminates what must be true, the conditions needed for sustainability to be possible. It's the starting place. It does not replace other goals, planning or otherwise, but it does enable them. And it does not dictate method, the how. It allows freedom for democratic choice and creativity, innovation. We can use any configuration that does not degrade regenerative systems functioning as an option. So we begin with the definition because everything follows from it. Sustainability is redefined from our familiar kind of fuzzy environmentally friendly definition to the system state of the regenerative Earth system, the environment. So we're defining it as a system state, a dynamic system state. From that state, we can define the core functions required for regenerative system functioning. And those functions become the conditions for sustainability. And then we label as, or I label as, regenerative systems performance imperatives. And they're shown on the right. There are 6 biophysical imperatives, and we add one, a decision and control imperative required for monitoring and enforcing compatibility integrity, for keeping us on track, keeping us honest. The key point is that these conditions are derived from the regenerative system functioning. They're not chosen by whim or any other criteria. The imperatives followed directly from how the system works, and they don't vary by application or implementation. Building on that definition, we now make the imperatives operational as compatibility conditions. These imperatives are biophysically grounded, they're non-negotiable if we want to be sustainable, and all must be satisfied for sustainability to be possible. The compatibility conditions are used to assess and redesign the economy's materials and processes. Couple notes. In RSS, the root cause of unsustainability is not environmental impacts, which are the symptom, but the current design of the economy's materials and processes, which cause those impacts. Thus, the solution in RSS is to redesign them for compatibility with regenerative system functioning, as shown in this figure. Although compatibility is non-negotiable, it's produced incrementally over time, quickly as possible, of course. But this compatibility method is what makes sustainability something that can be evaluated and worked towards systematically. A core insight of this approach is that the problem is not economic activity itself, it's the design of the materials and processes. And this reframes sustainability as a design problem grounded in physical regenerative system compatibility. And from this lens, sustainability becomes a little appreciated triple challenge. It's not only about reversing accelerating environmental degradation, the negative impacts, and it's not only about restoring and maintaining the regenerative functioning of the Earth system, the environment, but it's also economic. That is, creating a regenerative economy where the reversing and the restoring is done in ways that secure and expand the capacity for ongoing economic production and provisioning, but under conditions compatible with regenerative functioning. And that's kind of the missing link right now. They all must be achieved together. The key point is that RSS simultaneously delivers on the triple systems change challenge of sustainability. It decouples the economy from negative environmental impact, but in a mutually beneficial production enhancing way that reverses and restores. In summary, the method of RSS defines, assesses, and redesigns iteratively aligns materials, processes, and their associated systems with compatibility conditions. The RSS method uses a strategic planning process to illuminate the gap, to formulate a work program to close the gap, and an ongoing implementation to fully close it. As part of formulating and pursuing that strategic work plan, RSS uses what we've developed as best approach practices to change system trajectory. And one essential move that's important to understand is that we need to formulate the regenerative performance innovation agenda from the performance needed to close the gaps after existing capacity is used. Now we'll briefly review 2 parts of the method, BAPs and the innovation agenda. The BAPs are not traditional best technical practices with which you're familiar, but they're the steps and the heuristics formulated to help focus the planning and implementation on the key leverage points for changing system behavior and direction, i.e. for reversing course. We don't have time to review them in detail, but they're described in more detail in the URAG work mentioned in the beginning, and please email me for more information on that. The new innovation agenda is required for sustainability success. After existing capacity is used, the performance gap remains. The needed performance becomes part of the new innovation agenda, which society in turn develops and pursues with a research and development program to close the gap. The key point about this is that no one's working on this agenda now in a systematic way. Society's research function is focused on what we all know, basic research driven by disciplinary agendas, and its private function is focused on R&D for profit potential. This research, this RSS innovation agenda needs to be formulated and pursued. Now, the resource funnel is a useful visual aid to see the whole, to understand the implications of the accelerating trend and the sustainability challenge, opportunity, and benefit. The trend is the shrinking capacity for action as resources decline, costs increase, demand increases over time. We're not in a static reality. The sustainability opportunity is to stabilize the trend, stop the shrinking response capacity, and begin to redesign materials and processes for compatibility. The sustainability benefit is to expand restoration and economic abundance by accelerating the redesign and associated enabling requirements. The key is an effective sustainability response with the logic and capacity to change system trajectories. Now we'll briefly look at applying RSS to the built environment and the wider economy. A couple of key points. The built environment is high leverage because it locks in performance over long time horizons. The redesign for a regenerative built environment also enables the needed economic transformation. Those are the two aspects of high value. I just want to emphasize that the built environment is this catalyst for economy-wide alignment. Creating a regenerative built environment incidentally produces part of the foundation of the regenerative economy as a design act, an act of design, not an act of economic policy, et cetera. And there are many built environment features, particularly infrastructure, that's required as a first step to enable the full economy-wide transformation downstream. If we review current innovative practices in the built environment, we see at least 3 patterns that indicate likely directions if the RSS logic is used more systematically. A shift in the built environment performance from consumption to production, designing at district scale and shared infrastructure systems, which enables compatibility by restructuring relationships within the built environment, and integrating living systems into the core of the built environment to restore, maintain, and enhance regenerative system functioning. Applying RSS to the whole economy, we see that firms obviously are the primary actor, not the only one, but the primary one for redesigning. And the interesting part is that as firms adopt these imperatives for redesign of their products and processes, they translate the systems performance, the sustainability systems performance we need into operational decisions through design integrity, not normative behavior. And you can see a set of typical mechanisms include designing for disassembly, excluding toxics, structuring procurement around life cycle performance, evaluating capital investments using full logic cost, and deploying take-back product service models. Of course, as I mentioned, we need this to activate this innovation agenda as part of enabling the economy-wide transition, and the compatibility conditions can also be used for investment evaluation and filtering. And we'd expect as degradation increases and costs increase, et cetera, to see more and more capital flowing to the regenerative part of the economy and enabling that. And it's also important to note that the public sector's role under SS really changes from leading sustainability to being a steward that enables it. Public institutions are the only ones that can establish the legal, regulatory, and spatial conditions required for regenerative practices to become viable at scale. In summary, sustainability requires regenerative functioning, compatibility-based design, and directed innovation. RSS provides the necessary conditions logic for achieving this. In terms of implications for practice, regenerative city regions in Ukraine. Ultimately, sustainability is the only source of resilience. We need RSS to enable it. The Build Back Better challenge is the need for an effective approach for working in nested systems, where solutions at one location require functioning at other locations, and actions can ripple across systems unexpectedly. The response would be to use RSS as this missing first-order necessary conditions logic, provides a clear understanding. It can be used in all planning processes. Need to create the regenerative built environment as the high-value first move for the leverage it provides. Public sector needs to become stewards that enable the regenerative economy in partnership with firms and other actors. The innovation agenda needs to be launched and pursued. And one next step is likely trying to formulate the critical path to local and national sustainability. And that critical path would be incorporated into the strategic plans and implemented. And finally, we need to invent a new champion role capable of orchestrating the collaboration, the initiatives, and innovation required with whomever, wherever, and for as long as regenerative compatibility success takes. And that's a capacity that exists beyond current institutional and role capacities. So at this point, I want to thank you for listening to part one. I look forward to our discussion, and now I'm going to unshare my screen and hand it off to Charles.
Right. Thank you, Scott. This is part two, and the title of this section is The Role of Community Stewardship, sort of building on this, this imperative decision and control that I find in projects that I worked on that serve as a model for a concept for Ukraine through our URAG work in over the last 2 years. This is the role of community stewardship as a regenerative system sustainability entity that accelerates action to the transition to neighborhoods from degenerative to regenerative system sustainability, in the sense that the neighborhood and the district scale seems to be in my work, seems to be the key area where we can make accelerated action. It builds capacity in the neighborhood, in the community to take action in their own interest. By doing so, I found in my work that it provides resilience to hazard events. They could be man-made or naturally occurring. But the key is that it's dependent on creating economic and social vitality in those neighborhoods, which is a real benefit. And then it creates the organization to enable and sustain leadership roles in the stewardship concept for neighborhoods over a long period of time. And the reason why this became important is when we were working with URAG and a group of consultants who were attempting to establish how Ukraine might rebuild after martial law, and what we would do now in anticipation of that. We were testing ideas with the NGO of Vid Serca Budova in a test case in Tetiv, in a city called Tetiv in south of Kiev. And what we were testing was this idea that the technical and the civic processes to enable a regenerative system sustainability. What was the potential to do it in Ukraine now and in the future? And it had two components, a technical piece and a civic process piece. And I think Scott was underlining the importance of the system process as a decision and control imperative that comes along with thinking about technical aspects. So if you're going to make a circular economy, you could imagine the layout of a test fit in a part of a town with 140 square meters of area that could beginning to generate some of the social outcomes and economic outcomes of a regenerative system sustainability. And in planning this, we realized, wait a minute, we need some kind of governance or stewardship entity to help plan, operate, and then adapt this neighborhood. So it needed to have all those flexibility. And so what we were imagining was kind of this idea of an entity that could be organized to strengthen community capacity, to sustain economic vitality, use benign and regenerative systems in nature, and capture value to regenerate multi-generational community outcomes. And that key piece is that's the benefit of is regenerating outcomes for the community who's participating as a way of keeping them engaged. Now, what my practice sort of informed this diagram. You can go read Jeffrey Glenn's article in the article Shape of the Recovery, which is in the link here, which talks about IROs in Ukraine. And what that means, IRO means Intermediate Recovery Organization, an entity that kind of helps you get to the next place, no matter where you are and what community. But it's really about getting public, academic, and private and community stakeholders at the table, and then forming an entity that helps them coordinate and to align decision making, to find funding, and to work in their own interest for the long term. And what is common in my practice is that when they focus on the public realm and how it delivers economic and social cohesion, you're really in a place that's a magic place that allows you to make a place for community and in the world economy and the changing natural systems that are occurring through climate change. And so I'm going to show you the basis of that diagram for the Intermediate Recovery Organization, where it has a part in the US through my experience working in Portland. It has experience of exporting what we did in Portland to Tokyo and to Japan to help them recover from the Tohoku earthquake in 2011. And then how that fits in, hopefully you'll find how that fits into the Intermediate Recovery Organization that has a more regenerative system sustainability goal, where the others have other social or environmental goals. So just for your use, the diagram is you're kind of taking what the U.S. Oregon land use law that created a framework for public-private partnerships that allowed there to be alignment over a long period of time, that those individual projects could add up to something. And then in Japan, they created these entities called urban design centers that would be an overlay to the partners who were trying to act to find cooperative action and form resilience. And I think what you're trying to do in Ukraine is trying to put those together and form this Intermediate Recovery Organization, which is really a resilience entity in many ways, like the Japanese entity. So going to the Portland background, it really speaks to a regenerative system sustainability trajectory that is a government-led, as Scott mentioned, that has to create a framework or the rules, if you will, or the goals, if you will, for project design, their implementation, and their operation. And that involves a framework that that designs every agreement between the public and the private sector in alignment with a larger goal to have livability or some benefit that derived by that coordination that may be required for a permit. And that's what we created in Oregon to really drive the following outcomes. And that one is Portland was very polluted in air quality and water quality, and it seemed like a disaster we couldn't overcome. But what we did is we created a whole policy framework and a new way for public and private sector to work together that allowed us over the last 30 years to double our economy, but reduce our emissions by 25%. And in the United States, that was very rare. It still is in many ways, but it's that policy framework that holds that outcome together. And it bared out these projects such as removing the cars from downtown and their tailpipe emissions, which took up a lot of space and killed off many of the businesses downtown after people went home from work. It took a policy framework and public and private action to convince people that they could take a bus to downtown and be rewarded by a new environment in the public realm that connected every experience they had in the day and would allow them to linger in the afternoon, and that they would be rewarded by taking transit and be penalized. Obviously, we penalized them for taking a car, but we got an initiative to make that work, and we were able to get rid of some of the roads and build parks in some of those roads, and Waterfront Park was born. But at the same time, with the 30 feet above the water at Waterfront Park was pretty safe because the water really smelled. I mean, it was very polluted at the time. And so they had to take action to apply the same concept they had done in downtown to the entire region of Portland. So they had a watershed by watershed strategy to every project through a public-private partnership could demonstrate how it was reducing stormwater into the sewer system that was net creating these overflows. So we were using point source green infrastructure to do that, and now we have a clean waterfront. When the Japanese came to town to find a way to overcome the impacts of the Tohoku earthquake, they saw that we had a system, a framework for public-private partnership, and that the public realm was really turned out to be kind of the built environment that was equal to and directly related to the built economy, and that was intertwined with the policies we had in the watershed, land use, and to transportation, and that you could physically see the public realm as the win-win nexus of the transition to their system sustainability. And in 2011, a group of us from Portland were invited to help the Japanese government overcome the nationwide impacts for rolling power outages, strain adaptive capacity, and slowed economic recovery in Japan. And they were exploring many different options, but they were very interested in the capacitation of a framework, capacitated communities in a framework that, because there were studies floating around that the social dimension and the way cities held communities together really indicated their mortality rate during a hazard event. So all the tsunamis, when they hit the coast of Fukushima or Sendai, the communities that had low social cohesion had the highest mortality rate. And that what they inferred from this is that we need to make communication spaces in the public realm as a first priority to our response to building resilience in community in Japan. And they came up with this entity. They came up with a novel entity called the Urban Design Center that really harnessed the business and industries with the public, with guidance from academia, and formed what was called the Urban Design Center. And in the project I'm going to show you, the Urban Design Center is called the Urban Design Center Kashiwa no Ha, and I'll show you that project in a minute. But essentially, it's to promote community development at the same time you're doing real estate development. And you can, what they did was they endeavored to use their national interests to and industry and their policies to make a next generation eco-city as a result. And so that became our site and test bed for a Portland away team working with Japan, is to convert this transit-oriented development along the Tsukuba Express, just 20 kilometers north of Tokyo, convert it from a bedroom community to a mixed-use innovation district as a tool to insulate this community by building a better regenerative, not regenerative, but more economic stability and more social cohesion. And it went, what it ended up doing was taking is working with the UDC Kashiwa no Ha, or Urban Design Center Kashiwa no Ha, getting them with the community to understand how, by inviting business to co-locate with the residents, that they could form this open space that had activity all times during the day. And in permitting this, getting it certified as the largest LEED ND Platinum certified smart city in the world, to address super aging in society, to address population decline, to address unplanned disasters, and economic shocks. So it's kind of like a tool that they used in other projects. They branded it, sold it, this concept has now multiplied across Japan. I think I worked in 4 projects for 4 different UDCs. I'll show you one after this presentation. But the power of these entities was to really accelerate the improvements and vitality in the space they all shared, and they had the capacity and leadership to hold the community and those private and public investments together long enough to hold a discussion about, how do we quickly turn this stormwater retention basin that's fenced off into a public park to accelerate economic vitality and activity and purpose in this area. So I think the transition to this decision and control imperative is best illustrated by the Japanese concern for efficient delivery and accelerated delivery of resilience, like continuously tracking and engaging with the community, to adapting to societal change and iterating with this community advice. And that builds that transparency even in the market, for the real estate market, because they can expect certainty for the return on their investment. We then jumped to a mid-sized city called Maebashi and used the same concept over a whole city. And we found this key public space that was at the center of their social and economic prosperity, called Babagawa Street. And they formed a Maebashi Design Commission that rebuilt at the street with daylighted the water system to make a public space that connected nature, the economy, and the social values with a kind of a regenerative concept that's really sort of taken off. And even the ethic in building has sort of changed and kind of reformatted the image of Maebashi. So the big takeaways from my experience that I offer for your consideration is how the value of the community stewardship entity addresses this decision and control question that Scott raised, how it helps you transition through a new governance system, how it uses the public realm to regenerate outcomes and keep people's interest in how they can participate and make impact, and then therefore helps you transition from degenerating to regenerating sustainable systems. I'm now going to pause and show you how what I've learned in Ukraine, Japan, and Portland is being used again in Portland, because we have economic decline and not recovered from COVID, and it's really quite sad. And I was teasing Lilith that there were people from Portland were saying, "Well, why, Charles, are you presenting to Ukraine? Who cares?" Because we have such little confidence in our ability. So we invented this nonprofit called the People's Tributary that would form partnership, make improvements now, plan for the future, provide long-term stewardship. It's an IRO. And it basically acknowledges where we are and where we need to go. And the community sort of says, yes, that makes sense, and we want to join you. And we've been holding meetings about how the public realm can connect empty buildings and repurpose the ground floor, and how that's important and why people need to contribute. And we're building an entity that's going to connect these vital areas of our downtown to the Pearl District, Goose Hollow, Northwest, and West End through a really low, kind of unsafe and low economic value in the city to the waterfront, to enrich the waterfront, the neighborhood, and these other neighborhoods, so that it represents the vitality and interest of the community. It starts to show, so what are the initial projects? What's the long-term plan? Who benefits, and what are we going to get early and late? And how does that keep people engaged in the process? And we're currently fundraising right now to make street furniture that can be placed along these connections to improve the continuity of this experience, and to make settings for activities where the buildings cannot generate that activity and energy. So with that, I want to say that we're learning from our work in the cultural exchange with Ukraine, just in the same way we have in Japan. And I really welcome the conversation and look forward to learning more. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for these two wonderful talks and really get us in. And I think there are already quite some questions. Can you please put them in the Q&A tool underneath in your screen, then we have them all together. But let's start with some remarks and reflections from Tatjana. Could you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here, first of all, and also for the presentation of not only a framework that could be seen as very theoretical, that is the basis of all of these practices, but also bringing it into a practical example from different countries, including Ukraine. One of the things that is very important that everyone is taking very seriously right now in Ukraine, especially with rebuilding, building Ukraine back better, rebuilding Ukraine, the sustainability aspect and all the further phases of it are taken very seriously, not only because everyone wants to rebuild Ukraine in a better way, but also I feel like a lot of, especially funding sources, will be requiring sustainable approaches, which is great in terms of, we have a new baseline that is both required by the professionals and practitioners, but also by the funders that will be able to help with this rebuilding. When looking into the challenges of sustainability and best approaches, but also into some of the systems that work into this, there are already I already see a lot of organizations in Ukraine and administrations and hromadas that are moving into that direction. And at the same time, I also see capacity building challenges, which is part of, a lot of actually what URAG and Roskvid does is making sure that we close that gap a little bit, or we see where that capacity building challenge is, and where there can be very good approaches, new approaches, but also in helping those who are so invested in the rebuilding and that they can do it with what resources they have. One of the especially with capacity being a huge issue, I have a few questions that came out of your presentations, but also in the context of Ukraine. One of the questions that I will actually ask is the baseline to the other question that was posed by Alina Yehorova in the chat. It is very similar because mine is very general and hers is very specific to the frontline city of Kherson. With the capacity being a huge issue, what do you think there can be the lowest hanging fruit, or kind of like the first step for the process of RSS to start, to start? And I'm gonna phase it into the more specific question of Alina, how to adapt this RSS methodology to the context of the frontline city of Kherson, where, for example, the classical waste management is very hard or impossible because of all of the bombings that happen all the time and the destruction. There's ruins that actually have asbestos that is toxic from especially the broken roofs. And also there are some issues of items that could explode. Also, what are some of the express methods that could be, this is more specific to concrete reuse and, PVC and glass that could be already introduced today, especially when these materials could be going already in the rebuilding or renovating of the infrastructure, and so that they don't create actually more landfill creation. She also mentions that their organization, all that they could do was to buy PVC remaking section or posting on the local factory of the plastic things. And so what else could be, taken into consideration, or what some of the express kind of ideas could be taken and first steps to be taken in the realities that we have?
Are you posing that question to Charles and myself?
Yes, I think it's both a theoretical question, but also actually, especially looking into the examples of how the RSS method goes into, plays into the processes that Charles was explaining earlier. So where could you start with the process of the regenerative system sustainability? And also, how could that be taken into consideration with the first steps that could be taken in the current realities and with the current challenges and, the resources that are available?
Well, maybe I could start from just a pragmatic standpoint that I think this is the opportunity to form an organization that has a broad reach to coordinate the economy with the volunteerism that can be done on part of the neighborhood, and the wisdom that can be brought to how to do it most effectively, like just have a resource. My experience in Japan and other cities and Japan and other international cities where they're trying to recover is that it's the opportunity when the community and the government have a common goal, and you build an entity from that common goal because it has the power to act, um, uh, and people understand its value. And how do you turn that entity into how do you grow that entity and give it more capacity to be more efficient and more, um, um, how do you say, more effective in the moment, but with an idea about what it can do to improve transparency and livability once the cleanup has occurred, and to establish where the priorities need to be and how to nurture that social and economic prosperity. I think just think of it as a recovery entity that has many tasks.
Yeah. So what would you say is the difference between an IRO and, a traditional interagency model or organization?
Dot, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So it kind of gets to the points that I was making at the end about this new role, right? The IRO is really this new role that we're envisioning that grew out of practical experience, right? And and what it does is its goal is sustainability, right? Like everybody else's goal isn't sustainability. Everybody else's goal is, meet the budget of my agency and, do something good or get this building built or make some money or whatever, right? There's all these other goals out there from all the other actors. And so there's nobody coordinating this and focusing it on sustainability and what needs to happen for sustainability. And so that's basically the main difference, is that this IRO is a vehicle for making sustainability the goal and organizing all the other relationships and stakeholders around that goal. And I would also add that the challenge of sustainability is so much greater than the capacity, the existing capacity, our institutional capacity, our individual capacity, et cetera. It's going to take lifetimes. I mean, I'm going to be dead in 10 or 20 years, and we won't have made a dent in sustainability, right? So the new role and this new organization, in addition to being focused on sustainability, has to start developing the capacity to go the distance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's go the distance in time, it's go the distance in the system. Lots of time in a system, if you're working in reality where you think that all the parts are independent and there's no real causality that ricochets around the system, it's kind of not a problem. You can just focus on your little thing and do it and into the story, right? But if you understand that you're working in a system, a dynamic system where the parts are actually related in ways that create the functioning necessary for the system to exist, and then you go in and you mess around with it in some, bad way, you break that system. And so, the other part of working effectively on sustainability is understanding the systems idea and working in systems in ways that enhance the system instead of break it. And so, you might be focusing on a problem, in a city or in a sector or what have you. But in order to actually really make the difference to get to sustainability, you need something else to happen somewhere else, right? Like the simple example is if you want to use renewable energy, that infrastructure has to exist already. You have nothing to do with that. That's beyond your pay grade, so to speak. So that's the way I would answer that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it definitely like ranges into, not only the urban landscape, but also the economic development portion of it and the,
Yes.
The governance, as you both explained, how it is important and how, without the people, you also need to include the people that are going to be living there to be interested and to have the agency to work on that.
Can I get back to your first question, though?
Yeah.
Okay, just to kind of not dismiss that question, because that was a really an excellent question. I mean, the question is really like, how do you do RSS and what's the low-hanging fruit, right? I probably should have ended the slide with that, or my summary slide. I'm thinking up another slide. But, the short answer to RSS is this logic. It sounds esoteric, and like, what do I do with this thing? But in fact, it can be very simple. The simple steps are, we have a whole portfolio of highly advanced innovations in the built environment and even in the economy that we can use right now. All you have to do is know that they exist, value them, like this is a good idea, and figure out how to make them work, right? Finance them, I mean, a lot of this stuff you can either buy degenerative or you can buy regenerative. It's like not a big problem, right? So you have this portfolio of innovations out there, so use them. That's the first step with RSS. Use what we've got, right? Now, kind of jumping slightly forward into your second question, the problem with that question is, like, what do we do? Like, how do we do this when we're under attack and or recovering from massive destruction? Okay, I can't really answer that because I don't know. But I do know that if you have this logic in your brain and you're going forward, like, you're pretty much just going to be working on the fly with whoever you have that has the capacity to do this stuff. And I don't know how it's all going to be organized in Ukraine. And it's probably going to be different in every location, right? You've got different capacity, different people, different consultants on board, et cetera. So, my only real answer there is if you have this logic in your brain, you just problem solve with that logic. And so, for instance, you use whatever innovations you can get your hands on there. You use whatever resources in terms of consulting resources and funding resources, et cetera, are there. It's going to be a work in progress. But the other piece of this is that the RSS, it probably can get kind of complicated and involved, but in my mind right now, it's not. It's very simple. It's like, like, do you have 100% renewable energy or not? That gap's really big. So you know what direction to go in, right? Are you releasing toxics into the environment? Yes or no? I mean, just look at the International Living Future Institute's red list, right? Architects and urban designers have red lists. Like, don't use that stuff, right? The asbestos problem, yeah. I mean, but there's standard mitigative ways of doing hazardous remediation, right? I mean, those are all existing capacities. Somehow those capacities have to get targeted and tagged for these different areas. So what I'm saying though is that you can very quickly, if you just look at those six biophysical functions, you can just ask yourself back of the envelope, where's the
Mhm.
gap? Figure out what the
Yeah.
gap is and start moving forward. First step being use all the existing innovations that we have. And like I said, the second step is we can't get there from here, right? We have to inform an innovation agenda and direct resources to systematically address that as quickly as possible. Like
Mhm.
there's no other answer. That's not going to happen on the front lines of the war in Ukraine, right? But but the the immediate work around addressing those front lines issues will be surfacing these larger issues that need attention. And if we can create a mechanism to direct those issues into this research agenda, like at, for instance, the universities in Ukraine, right? Like, I mean, my first thought about how to activate this innovation agenda is create an IRO with all the universities and reframe their or some or all of their research resources and attention on the innovation agenda that needs to happen to create the capacity to close the full gaps.
Mhm.
And again, that's also why I mentioned all of the, I don't know how realistic it is that, this RSS, this sustainability planning needs to happen not only in neighborhoods, not only in the built environment, not only in the economy, but from the local to the national level, right? Because
Mhm.
there's lots of things that like I said, you can't do at one level unless they're done at another level. And so there's
Mhm.
this integration that needs to happen as well.
Thank you, Scott. And I think this is a great segue to kind of both confirm, but maybe also add a little bit more to your conversation in the question from Asa about how, first of all, she thanks you for the presentation, but also how to make sure that the regenerative approach is not only limited to metropolitan brand new eco districts, but that it actually promotes low investment, local grassroots based organizations. You touched upon that a little bit already with kind of the small first steps, but would you like to expand on that a little bit more?
Well, maybe I could interject that I've done,
Mm-hmm.
I think in my work, there's always a common theme, um, between greenfield and brownfield is
Mm-hmm.
that, greenfields get behind because they don't have enough social economic capacity. And
Yeah.
then brownfields get behind because they don't have any social economic capacity. And so they are kind of linked and it's kind of the same strategy. The approach for a greenfield is like building a coalition and there's no community there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's harder and it takes more capital and you're going to rely on the economy a lot more. But when you're working in brownfield, like when the difference between Kashiwa Noha and Maibashi is that Maibashi had a population, they could bring their work, their wealth, and their wisdom, right, through the IRO to take action immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Kashiwa Noha, they had to build a community who was unsatisfied. They built all that housing and they had a shopping mall and everyone was driving and it was very unpleasant. Once they had that community, they could then adapt and change.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't be building these communities and on behalf of communities and speak for those communities. It has to have a for them, by them component. And so that's really the threshold. And I think that's the richness of Ukraine is that you have a very motivated community. Some are displaced, some are concentrated in their displacement. Some are distributed, and there's some that are not, dispersed and have carrying a lot of burden. Well, each of those communities has a different need in an IRO
Mm-hmm.
and has different resources in their IRO.
Yeah.
And it's just, I think that's the important thing to acknowledge that you've got this amazing human capital of consistency and aspiration that the IRO can harness to direct private capital and government policy. That's your strength right now, in my
Mm-hmm.
opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the people's willingness to step up and do things is very great. I think that as the longer we go, the more those that are the most active are getting very close to burnout. So it's really important, I feel like, to also like have these organizations, right? Have
Yep,
these um, systems that can sustain not only the system itself, but also the people who are within it that are working sometimes after like, you know, a sleepless night
yeah,
because of the attacks, but also just the constant drive that they're trying to make it work and make it work for everybody else.
exactly.
So these systems are definitely very, very important to have and to sustain everybody. Yeah. Lilith, would you like to also
Yes.
ask anything?
I saw a next one. We have a lot gathered in the Q&A, and one was reflecting, and I also thought about that to dig a little bit deeper in those levels of governance. If you think about the, let's say, the groups and the responsibilities, maybe you can take it one step further, because Vladislav Palchuk says when Charles spoke about a network of policies, it raised the question like, who is involved, who are the main actors, and are these municipal level, national level, and I think you both explained that it should contain all the levels. And that's very important. At the national level, it's more the rules of the game, let's say, and from that the district level to until the users and the citizens. But maybe you can take it one step further and then also take into consideration that all those levels at this moment in Ukraine, and it very much taps into what Tatjana just said, are struggling. They're struggling in capacity, they're struggling in resources, money wise, financially, but also in knowing they have to create these kind of new systems in the middle of a war where immediate needs are need to be done. So also on a municipal level, it's not there is a lack of will to think about those longer term actions. That's actually what happened from the very first instance, that municipalities were also approaching us to think like, we know that we need to create cities of the future in which our population wants to live, because otherwise they go now and they stay in Europe, in other countries, and they will not come back. So we have to build attractive cities, economically viable cities, green cities, beautiful cities. That acknowledgement was there from the very beginning, but then we get to the how, and it's a tough one how to achieve that in all those different levels, because then sometimes the lower levels bump into the pace. It also has to do with timing, of which the national level is not ready of putting these rules of the game. And if those rules are not being laid out, then they cannot, because the national level has now been put into the municipalities to create their future municipal plans, let's say their master plans, their regional plans.
Mhm.
But how can they do that if they don't know on the upper level what the rules of the game are? So, do you have ideas, suggestions? I realize the question is a hard one, but
The questions are getting harder. Um, uh, I think
Kelley.
that's the main observation. But I think to keep it unusually simple, it's that two things can exist: a failure of national government and the success of, oblast or state government and prefectural government. You can have we have California, which is the seventh greatest economy in the world. It's not it had to be independent in some way to achieve that, right, on a national level, right? It had to create its own competitive advantage. And I think that what I can say about Oregon that as a state is that we are the only goal-based state in the country, that our planning laws must demonstrate how the onus is on the applicant to demonstrate how they're achieving the goals for society. It's not on government's role to say this is what you should build. It's on the applicant demonstrating that it's creating opportunities for society and that the impacts are worth the mitigation or lack of mitigation. That's the key thing that Japan used from the United States or from Oregon, is that we could be independent and represent ourselves and advocate for ourselves. And we created goals for ourselves. So there's 10 statewide planning goals that are essential at every development agreement. You have to go through and not check the boxes, but you have to demonstrate in each one of those goals how you're meeting them and how on balance you're meeting livability or sustainability. And I think that that's a good model. We saw in Japan, they used that model at different prefectures and in different cities because everyone's competing for talent, capital. They're trying to attract money. They're trying to keep community interest. That's where the beauty of the IRO and in a pretty enlightened prefectural oblast state, that's, I think, has some power there that maybe gets to answer your question, maybe gives you a little bit of hope. But how it works is very complex and it depends on the actors. But I've seen that works a lot. And I've worked, in many states, California is really hard to work in because it's got so many top-down, right? I mean, it's got so many regulations. So there's one thing, it's kind of top-down, it's very driven economic development, but it's very mature. And it's got some very successful businesses where Oregon doesn't have any of that. We had to ground source ourselves. We had to work. So that maybe that's a way to look at it. I don't know. Scott, you've seen me talk about that before, but you have something to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that. There's the economy itself, the base of the economy, which is sort of its own question, right? Are you going to be tech-based or ag-based or what have you? There's probably an answer for the future for Ukraine in terms of competitive advantage, et cetera. So that's a different analysis and a different kind of trajectory. What was I going to say? The one thing that stuck out at me when you were talking, Lillette, was that the states and localities don't necessarily need to wait for the national level to set the rules. In fact, if they have their finger on the pulse of the way they need to build back, they can in fact set those rules. Recommend or even they have some latitude themselves, right? But then they bump up against the need for some national agreement or authority or what have you, and then they have this need. It needs to be this way at the national level. That's the best way for all of us. So why don't we set those rules at the national level? But again, it requires a conversation and a relationship pointed in a particular direction, and that's kind of where the IROs go. And so you can kind of, I don't know, but I'm kind of envisioning a nested hierarchy of IROs, right? You've got this sort of one that has kind of a national reach, and then you've overlapping with and members of the local IROs, for instance. And that also might be a way of leveraging, providing some additional capacity, maybe even at the local level. Because it probably doesn't take many people to be able to have their brain and their eyes on the local challenge and the long range goals or direction, right? And understand like what has to happen. Whereas it takes many people to kind of solve the immediate problem of, unexploded ordinances or what have you, right? And so those IRO people, those few people can really leverage decisions, leverage resources, direct resources in ways that, locals that are enmeshed in a particular situation just don't have the capacity to do. The other, one other aspect of this is that, I don't know if I mentioned this, but, the sustainability thing is definitely voluntary, right? Like it's hard to imagine how you could legislate it per se, because legislation is a voluntary act, right? It requires like all these people to get on board. And so, it's going to grow up out of individuals recognizing something and taking action. And with this RSS piece, there is this sort of this interesting overlap there. Like I'm proposing this logic, this simple sort of logic that has the potential to change things. But, in terms of the example that Charles just gave, which is a very powerful example of one state having this planning sort of authority and control and exerting that. I worked in planning and environmental planning for a long time, and those checklists, you can sort of fudge those checklists pretty easily, right? It's like, oh yeah, this will sort of broadly meet the public interest in some way. And so, if you add an RSS framework to that, or an RSS compatibility test to that, all of a sudden it provides very concrete biophysical conditions that you can test against. It's like, does this project do this, that, or the other thing? Does it push us away from sustainability or towards it? And so but again, nobody's going to pick this up unless, individuals just understand it and start using it. It would also, start affecting the regional question that Tatiana brought up, which is how are we going to funnel, resources to the regions? Well, that just sort of depends on existing infrastructure, et cetera. But there's this relationship between the cities and the regions and internationally. And, a systems perspective starts teasing those things out and making the connections, the important and leverage connections, more visible.
Thank you. Tim, please.
Yeah, thanks. I'm kind of a quasi-panelist. I'm using my power of quasi-panelist to interject. So
Good.
I also reacted in the chat about regional IROs. In the vein of great minds think alike, one of my very first thoughts in 2022, being a regional planner, so we have three scales represented here. We have an urban designer, we have a city planner, and I'm a regional planner. And my immediate thought was many infrastructure issues are best addressed at the regional level, whatever you want to call it, whether it's an oblast or a river basin. Environmental issues are often addressed more appropriately at the regional level. And I also was grappling with the question of how to leverage efficiently international resources, whether they be development bank officials and their money and their consultants and so forth, with such a huge recovery challenge in Ukraine. And what I thought was you could form I wasn't using the acronym IROs at the time, but some kind of regional organization, which included representatives from local governments, as well as the regional government, representatives from development banks or their consultants from the national government. And hopefully there is a future not too far off where something like an IRO would have the power, the freedom to behave in such a way that none of those organizations and the representatives would have dominion over the others. So they're all equals.
That's
And
right.
my answer to the regional question is you could do nested IROs. You could have local IROs. You could have representatives of local IROs sitting on a regional IRO and so forth.
So one little follow-up thought I've had is that piggybacking on everybody's point here is that it seems like the problem we're sort of raising is one of diffusion. You know, it's like we've got ideas that we want to harness to funding and resources to create outcomes. And how do you do that when you don't control any of that stuff, right? And so that's kind of the question mark that we have here. But if you start thinking about how to leverage like a diffusion process, two things come to mind. One is I would deputize every planning program in the country and leverage students and have them prepare, mock-up plans or initial plans or drafts or whatever. I mean, you can get a lot of done quickly just by marshaling them. They're not at the front lines, et cetera. The other thing is international design competitions. I was impressed by the International Living Futures Institute. I mean, you see them a lot of places, but I was impressed by something they did back in 2010 or 11, where they just said, hey, we're going to have an international design competition on living cities or living communities, I think, living cities maybe. And they had 100 or 200 applicants that donated their time to come up with different designs, et cetera. And they created a whole living communities program that lasted for 10 or 15, like 8 years or so off of that. And they got some grant funding for it, et cetera. I mean, think about living Ukraine, regenerative Ukraine. What would that look like? Well, throw it out to the international design community and see what they come up with, and have them come up with it in ways that you can actually take to permit. I mean, I don't know. I'm brainstorming here only, but my thinking goes in that direction.
Thank you. I think when we look into kind of to recap as well what you have been talking about, especially with the questions of like what is the best to what is the best nesting system, what is the best system of making it happen, where do we start from, especially like a lot of questions are always like, okay, so what concrete thing we'd start from. And from what both of you, Scott and Charles, have talked about is, to concentrate on the feasibility of things, but also look into the longer term of how that can contribute to the goals of the overall system. Some of the questions were, related to this as well. And I think it was really great to have this evolution of the answers. One of the things that I'm trying to consolidate some of Krishna's questions, and they kind of go in a chain of how we have certain ways where I think this is related to the question that Alina had about what could be done in Kherson. And so we can do a few different ways of recycle concrete for building blocks, contouring landscapes. You can have steel be extracted for reuse, plastic multiple uses, etc. So that's one of the concrete ways. But going back to the IROs, it can be, how does the IRO make its decisions and the feasibility of the decision that can be implemented in the real way. And I think after that, at what point do we get other disciplines to contribute to the efforts, get involved to ensure that the plans actually get, made in a cost-effective manner. As you said, Scott, it can actually get to permitting phase, and can, that bureaucratic-driven process, how do we also ensure accountability, and where does it go into the decision making. So I think it's also related to Tim's point about, different, can we have the different levels of IROs on a regional level, on a local level, and even connecting to the chat. One of I think Asa mentioned how there are the bodies of self-organization of the population. Could that be an option, or would we need something completely new, or someone who a group that encompasses more professions and more people on different levels? I think I made it a little too complicated right now, trying to connect many things. But let's start with, how does the IRO make its decisions and the feasibility of the decisions being implemented?
Well, I mean, my clients have been IROs, and the fees paid to me was probably oftentimes through the real estate entities and the city. And then what the process that we used, I mean, the best IROs just provide leadership, and then they have a decision-making side of them that's agreed upon by all the stakeholders, because each stakeholder in the government representatives, the business representatives, the community representatives, and the academic representatives, they have to hold their identities and strengths separate from the IRO. So they come to the table with a good idea, right? And then that group assesses the goodness of that idea. And that's really what it is. It's like a testing zone for good ideas. Like, you don't show up to an IRO going, hey, I want to pay back 6 people who voted against us, right? It's not, it's I think I've got a good idea. It comes from the business sector. And then the academic sector says, that could really help. And the city goes, oh, I could see that. And this, it's sort of like it's an additive improvisational process, and it has to frame good ideas, and then it has to set a table for volunteers to participate, and they can enrich themselves as a volunteer. They could get in the backside some outcome, but that would be transparent. But that you want to have a place for people to give their wisdom. You need a place for them to give money, and they need a place for them to do work. And that IRO has fundamentally those people in mind when it's making a decision. How am I going to get them to invest? How am I going to get them to advise? And how am I going to get them to show up? So just think of it, it's like an elementary school parent group raising money for their school. And the kids are the most important thing.
Right. I think, Charles, that kind of outlines the IRO and the governance, but it seemed like you'd also been involved in them, and they had also provided leadership and guidance around the processes that generated plans or projects or what have you as well, right? And those are more your standard urban design and planning processes.
But I was just trying to boil it down to like the good ideas that we need to have a plan, and maybe it needs to have a plan with some strategies that have today and tomorrow in mind. I mean, it's just there are a bunch of good ideas that are held together in those plans, and so it's just fundamentally finding and using good ideas that help people enrich themselves and others. Mm-hmm. It's just kind of sad how simple it is, and we make it really complex.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's honestly a great kind of wrapping up conclusion to this, that we do make it very complicated when it's often very important to step back and look at the simple things and the first steps that we can take towards it. And especially we have so many passionate people that can get into this and create these systems.
Yes, I want to make one remark on the international competition because I do think it can be relevant to collect some ideas, but on the other hand, I think it's also very dangerous is maybe too big a word, but it's the whole setup of your talks and what you were saying is the very much the role of the local and the role of the citizens and the role of the people who actually know what they need. And therefore I think it's super important to keep that on the front of the thinking. So it needs to, Charles put it I think that way, like it starts from the people and then it goes back up. You mentioned that as well. So I think especially in circumstances of those conflict, it's the foreign input can be very relevant, but it should be asked from inside. So that would be my only comment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I also know that you agree with that. So it's there were a lot of more questions and we couldn't have them all, so that's a very good sign. There were also a couple of questions from Nicolas, who was we're all addressing basically about cleanup and the use of rubble and the use of reuse. Nicolas, I would say stay tuned, because I definitely think we need another organize a lecture around that. We had some others starting to tackle that topic, but I think it's a very good one to dedicate a whole session at some point around that. And I know some Ukrainian firms who are already and there are also engineers for recovery who are thinking about that. So thank you for that questions, and sorry that we couldn't get our heads around that right now.
See part three of URAG's guidelines. We have a whole module on waste management and land cleanup, which I wrote.
Look at that. Thank you, Tim, for introducing your wonderful colleagues to us and to the RoseFit community. Thank you all for being here. Main thanks, of course, to Charles and Scott for all your input, but also Tatjana for your wonderful wrapping up and co-hosting.
Thank you, Lilith, and thank you, Elena, for translating this.
As always, as a brilliant move. Thank you all, and stay tuned. Look at our YouTube channel for older lectures, and also this one can be found from tomorrow onwards, so you can also forward it. And we will put some of the links that you sent and that you gave in the beginning, Scott. We will put under the YouTube channel so people can use it for further readings.
Great.
Thanks a lot.
Terrific.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Afternoon, morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.